Welcome back to our series of educational videos for Northern Virginia homeowners. My name is Frank Felker, and I'm joined again by the expert in home remodeling and improvement, Jeremiah Davies, president of Orion Home Improvements. How are we doing today, Jeremiah?
Fantastic, Frank, and thanks for having me here.
Well, today we want to talk about all things trim. There's a lot of trim around the house, and it's kind of troublesome. Let's start out with, what the heck is trim? We hear a lot of different names for it. If you would, give us some examples of the words that are used by people in the profession to describe different types of trim, and why do we have trim? What does it do for us?
All right. Well, the names for trim can get a little tricky. There's, some basics on a home. If you stand out in your front yard, look at your house, and kind of see where your gutters are attached to, you've got, starting there, that's a facial trim behind the gutter. Moving into your soffits, and when it connects back to the wall, you'll have your freeze boards. There's also rakes and scotias and brick molds, and I think you kind of get the picture. There's a lot of different names for them, but really the essential idea here is that that wood trims are made to kind of basically give the house a nice clean line and make sure that transitional surfaces, whether you're going from brick to siding or from siding to wood or whatever the case may be, you've got a piece that kind of caps it off and finishes everything out.
And so there's names, you mentioned a couple, and I think sometimes, as with a lot of different professions, homeowners may think that remodelers and home improvement companies use different words to kind of keep us in the dark about exactly what they're talking about. Can you tell us, what's a fascia, soffit, dental, just a quick explanation of what each one of those are so we know what we're looking at when we're looking at our house?
Sure, and it's a very good and valiant point. You go to any profession, whether you go to a law office or you go to a doctor's office, and you sit down with those professionals, they have terms and words and things they use in their professions, and there's no difference with our profession here. But going back to that, if you want to talk about the basics of a house, you've got, let's say, a rake trim. If you ever hear someone talking about a rake trim, this is the transitional piece of trim that goes from where your roof line transitions to your wall. So if you have an apex of a house, and basically look at the wood that would be trimming up along this apex portion, that would be a rake. Whereas we talked about before, the fascia is the boards that go back behind the gutters. And then once you get to where the soffit, which is the overhang, you look up and you see that overhang part, that's called a soffit. That transitions into the house. And again, right along this area where it transitions the wall, you'll have a fascia, a freeze board. A freeze board. Now that freeze board can be a flat plane. It can have some cutout grooves called dental blocks, lots of different things that go along with it. So when you're talking about what some of these things are called and names, don't be intimidated by the names. Just realize that they are all different types of trims and they need different kinds of attention on your home.
That's great. I appreciate you clarifying that. And I know that there's also trim of various types around windows and doors and that type of thing. Is that only for appearance sake, or is there also a functional aspect of that type of trim?
Well, in many cases, some of that trim has both a functional and aesthetic appearance kind of use. If you can imagine that, when you're working with some materials, lots of cuts, lots of bends, lots of angles, not everything is going to come out exactly the same when you're cutting pieces to length. So let's take an old wood siding, for example. Wood siding boards are cut, they get put up on the house, they expand, they contract, they're natural, they're going to move. And so instead of having an area where everything kind of comes up to a side and you have a bunch of different layers like my fingers here, if you can see that, not everything is touching. But if I were to basically kind of take and put a flat trim over here, now what we have is a line that goes straight down. So it does two things. It protects and closes a gap where some moisture could get in behind that wall cladding. And it also gives it the straight line appearance so it has a good clean finish and allowing the materials to expand and contract and move while still keeping the good clean lines.
That was a great explanation and a great example there with your hands. It made it very clear what you were talking about. Now, in spite of all the wonderful things that trim does for us, it seems like it's one of the most troublesome aspects of exterior maintenance for a home. Why is that? Why is there always problems with trim?
Well, it's a matter of kind of out of sight, out of mind. And what I mean by that is you walk up to your home and you don't notice the small changes that happen day after day. And traditionally, trims have been made and milled through wood products. And so you have a wood product that, when it's exposed to the weather and the elements, will rot. So a lot of homeowners don't really understand that every couple of years you should have some caulking maintenance or look at repainting and touching up the paint on your home. It's when those maintenance items aren't taken care of is when we really see the problems of wood and weather deteriorating the trims on a home.
Well, it makes sense. Wood does deteriorate. It looks great, but it doesn't hold up forever and ever. So what are our options in terms of maybe coming up with some trim replacements that'll be a little bit more maintenance free?
Absolutely. Obviously the industry kind of responded to some of those issues, and we're looking at items that while there's nothing that's actually 100% maintenance free, there are things that require quite a bit less maintenance and still perform very well. Some of those would be a synthetic. I'm sure people have maybe heard of the brand name Azek. It's like what Kleenex is to tissue, Azek is to synthetic trim. So the PVC or plastic trims are milled out and molded to mimic the look of natural wood. Once it's installed in the house, it does really kind of eliminate the use for weather. There's also fiber cements. You can have a fiber cement compound that's put together, a very heavy duty, very rough looking material that mimics the wood without, again, the maintenance rot issues. And I would say that, Frank, the last kind of option that's there, and probably one that most of our customers tend to go for because of the practicality and the cost aspect of it, is taking your existing wood trim on your home and then capping it with an aluminum sheet over it. So custom trim capping or wood wrapping is some terms that are used.
Now, I know I've seen some applications of trim wrap that end up not looking as nice as the original wood trim. And I wonder if those homeowners might have felt as though they'd made the wrong decision going with trim wrap, when it ends up, it actually does have a noticeable change in the appearance of the home, even to an untrained eye. Is there any way around that? Is there any way to get a nice trim wrap job done that still looks nice?
Sure there is. And just like anything, it's kind of starting with educating yourself as a consumer and a homeowner. The first thing that a homeowner needs to realize is that basically what you're doing is you're taking a flat piece of metal, and then you have to turn, twist, bend, and conform it to fit the face of the wood or whatever trim you're covering. And so what you do is you start out with the metal, and you got to realize there's a few different types of metals. There's a smooth painted metal, which gives it a very clean, crisp appearance. But the paint can oxidize, the paint can scratch. Anything that happens with paint on metal, it can happen with this trim capping. Then you have what would be called a high performance coil, which would be a metal sheet with a non-scratch surface, a small bit of texture, but still it has that kind of clean, smooth appearance. And then finally, having a wood grain texture PVC or plastic that's coated to your aluminum. So just starting with the right metal material can give you a heads up. Once we move on from there, what you're really looking at now is the craftsmanship. That's the artistry that comes with someone who knows how to bend it. Most anybody can put a flat sheet of metal in a break and give you a 90-degree angle or a 45-degree angle or some very basic angles, but it takes a true craftsman to be able to mimic the details of a fluted column or to give a radius to a flat sheet of metal. There's special tools and special skills that are required. So what I would recommend is, before making any decision about what you're going to do with hiring a contractor, see some very specific examples of their work on a house. Anybody can take a few pictures of somebody else's work and show you, but see some exact pictures of what these artisans are capable of and make sure you're getting what you're expecting.
That's great. That is great advice. Yeah, seeing is believing. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and I think we're coming to the end of this interview. Are there any last pieces of advice that you'd want to leave our Northern Virginia homeowners with regarding trim?
Actually, I think the most common thing and kind of piece of advice I have to give homeowners as we're talking about how to mostly kind of maintain and fix their homes, and this is not so much in a full replacement scenario, but more on a maintenance issue, is we get into, say, a large box window, or you've got several windows on the face of the home that have a few pieces of trim that are rotted out, soft. I would always recommend to replace trim sections in full lengths, making sure that you don't have seams halfway through the run. Even a scarf joint, which is where it's a kind of an angled cut that laps over to keep it nice and flat, those can look very horrible after it's all said and done. So where it may seem that spending several hundred, even $1,000 on replacing trim versus a couple $100 for small pieces down at the bottom might be saving some money in the long run, you're really not going to be happy about that. And then the other advice I would be is, if you're going to replace trim, do it with like materials. This idea I've had from many customers as well: if I'm going to replace it, why don't I put the plastic materials here and leave my wood, and I'll just replace it as it goes around. Well, that too, it looks very, very patchwork and odd. And although we have done it from time to time for customers, 9 times out of 10, the customers are very dissatisfied with the work, and we have to come back and kind of finish it out to give it a nice, clean look for them. So that would be my advice, and I hope that it helps somebody make a great decision out there.
That is great advice, Jeremiah. I really appreciate what you had to share. I thank you for joining us today, and thank you for watching. We'll see you back at our next episode of our educational series for Northern Virginia homeowners.
Thanks, Frank.